The grand halls of the Veltheri Empire's royal court were unlike anything Lieutenant Daniel Carter had ever seen. Towering crystalline pillars shimmered under the artificial light, casting refracted rainbows across the polished black marble floors. Alien nobles moved like ghosts, their flowing robes trailing behind them, their glowing eyes full of silent judgment. Among them, on the highest throne, sat Princess Zyra, the future ruler of the Veltheri. Daniel, a human soldier, stood at attention, his military training keeping him still and unreadable. But deep inside, he could feel the weight of the room pressing on him. He wasn't here as an enemy. He was assigned as part of a diplomatic mission, a security escort for the princess herself. Zyra's gaze settled on him, sharp and calculating. Unlike the soft-spoken nobles around her, she radiated power and command. She had been raised among the finest warriors of her kind, trained in etiquette, strategy, and battle. She had expected to meet a human representative who would be intimidated by her presence. But Daniel did not bow. He did not lower his gaze. It irritated her. "You must be the human soldier assigned to my protection," Zyra said, her voice cool but laced with authority. "Lieutenant Daniel Carter, was it?" Daniel nodded, his expression unreadable. "That's me, Your Highness." A murmur passed through the court. Some of the nobles stiffened at his casual tone, his lack of reverence. Zyra, however, remained still, her delicate fingers tapping lightly against the armrest of her throne. "You do not kneel before royalty?" she asked, arching an elegant brow. Daniel smirked slightly, shifting his weight. "In my world, we don't kneel for leaders. We stand beside them." More whispers, more stiffened postures. Zyra felt her pride flare. No one had ever spoken to her this way. Every Veltheri, noble or soldier, treated her with the respect her bloodline demanded. This human, however, seemed unimpressed. The princess studied him closely. He was taller than most Veltheri males, his build lean but strong, his posture relaxed yet disciplined. There was something wild about him, something that did not belong in the orderly world of the Veltheri court. Zyra had always prided herself on keeping her emotions in check, maintaining the poise of a ruler. Yet this human, without even trying, had unsettled her in mere moments. "Very well, Lieutenant Carter," she said, regaining her composure. "Your job is simple. You will remain by my side and ensure my safety during the upcoming peace talks. Do you believe yourself capable of such a task?" Daniel gave a small shrug. "Depends. How much trouble do you usually get into?" For the first time in years, Zyra almost lost her composure. A flicker of something strange and unfamiliar passed through her. Annoyance. Amusement. She couldn't tell. One thing was certain. This human soldier was going to be a problem. The corridors of the Veltheri palace were silent except for the soft click of Princess Zyra's boots against the polished floor. Beside her, Lieutenant Daniel Carter walked with the ease of a man completely unaffected by the grand alien architecture around him. His hands rested casually at his sides, his eyes scanning every shadow, every doorway. A soldier always on guard. Zyra stole a glance at him. She was still irritated by his lack of respect in the throne room. Humans were supposed to be crude, unsophisticated, and beneath the Veltheri in every way. But Daniel, he didn't act inferior at all. "I must say," Zyra began, her tone controlled but sharp, "you humans have an unusual way of showing respect to those above you." Daniel didn't even look at her. Respect is earned, not given. Zyra stopped walking, turning to face him. He halted as well, raising an eyebrow. "You think I have not earned respect?" she asked, tilting her chin slightly. Daniel met her gaze without hesitation. "I don't know you, Princess. All I know is that I've been assigned to protect you. That doesn't mean I have to treat you like a goddess." Zyra's fingers twitched. How dare he? No Veltheri would ever speak to her this way. Even the strongest warriors in her court bowed before her without question. This human, he was different. She took a breath, pushing down the irritation. Losing control of her emotions was a weakness. She would not let a mere soldier shake her. "Tell me, Lieutenant," she said, continuing down the hallway, "how do you intend to protect me if you refuse to follow orders?" Daniel sighed. "Look, Princess, I follow orders when they make sense. But if something's stupid or dangerous, I'll do what I think is best." Zyra gave him a side glance. "Disobedience can get you killed." Daniel smirked. "So can blind obedience." For a moment, Zyra had no reply. She had trained in war tactics her whole life, studied battle histories of countless empires. But never had she heard a soldier speak like this. They reached a set of tall doors, guarded by two Velthari warriors in silver armor. Zyra nodded at them, and they stepped aside, opening the way to her private chambers. "You'll be stationed outside my quarters," she informed Daniel, stepping inside. "I expect you to." Suddenly, the lights flickered. A sharp noise rang out, a metallic click, the unmistakable sound of a weapon being primed. Daniel moved first. In one fluid motion, he grabbed Zyra by the arm and pulled her back, pressing her against the wall just as a plasma bolt shot through the air where she had been standing. Her heart pounded. Someone had just tried to kill her. Daniel crouched low, his pistol drawn, scanning the shadows. His voice was calm but firm. "Stay behind me, Princess." For the first time in her life, Zyra had no choice but to obey. The next morning, the royal court was abuzz with whispers. The assassination attempt had been a sharp reminder that Princess Zyra's life was far from safe. But what truly caught everyone's attention wasn't the attack. It was the human soldier who had reacted faster than any Velthari bodyguard. Lieutenant Daniel Carter stood by her side again, his presence unnervingly calm. Zyra still felt the lingering tension from the night before, but she refused to show it. She had an image to maintain. As the princess entered the ceremonial hall, the nobles turned their attention toward her. A large open arena lay before them, a place where Velthari warriors displayed their skill in combat for the royal court's approval. This wasn't just tradition, it was a statement of strength and poise. Zyra was expected to demonstrate that she was not only a diplomat, but also a capable warrior. Zyra's golden armor glinted in the pale blue light, her long silver hair tied back in a tight braid. She looked every part the warrior princess, calm, elegant, and deadly. But inside, her mind churned. The attempt on her life had left her wary of everyone around her. Trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. "Princess Zyra," the court herald announced, his voice echoing through the hall, "will face a challenger of her choosing to prove her readiness to lead." Traditionally, she would select a Velthari warrior, someone she knew she could outmatch. This was about maintaining her image, not risking her safety. But today, something inside her shifted. She glanced at Daniel, standing stoically at the edge of the arena. "Lieutenant Carter," she said, her voice steady, "I choose you." The court erupted in murmurs. A human. A soldier from a race they considered inferior. It was unthinkable. Daniel's eyebrows rose slightly, but he stepped forward without hesitation. "As you wish, Your Highness." The arena was prepared, and the two opponents took their positions. Daniel wore only his standard combat gear, no ceremonial armor or enhancements. Zyra's armor and staff gave her a clear advantage, but her opponent's calm confidence unsettled her. The signal was given, and Zyra moved first. She spun her staff in a fluid arc, a blur of golden light, aiming to disarm him quickly. But Daniel was fast, faster than she had expected. He sidestepped her strike and countered with a swift, controlled movement, forcing her to adjust her footing. The Velthari nobles watched in stunned silence. Zyra was their pride, their future queen, yet this human soldier was holding his own. Zyra felt her frustration grow. No matter how hard she tried, Daniel seemed to anticipate her every move. Her strikes, usually flawless, felt clumsy in comparison. For the first time in years, she was truly challenged. And worse, she couldn't ignore the small, infuriating smile on Daniel's face. It was as if he was enjoying this. When the match finally ended, neither had been defeated, but Syra knew she had lost something far more important than a duel. She had lost the certainty that she was untouchable. And that was something she would never admit, not even to herself. The aftermath of the duel left the court in a mix of awe and confusion. Princess Syra had always been untouchable, regal, composed, and unmatched in combat. But the human soldier, Lieutenant Daniel Carter, had stood his ground, defying their expectations. The Velthari nobles whispered among themselves, trying to make sense of what they had just witnessed. Syra, however, had no time for their murmurings. The attempted assassination and the duel weighed on her mind. Her poise remained intact, but deep down, questions swirled. How had an outsider, someone not even Velthari, managed to challenge her so effortlessly? And more importantly, how had he managed to save her life when so many of her own kind had failed? The princess retreated to her private quarters, but the rest she sought was short-lived. A message arrived, sealed with the mark of the Royal Intelligence Division. She broke the seal and read the parchment with narrowed eyes. The intelligence was grim. A high-ranking noble suspected of treason was hiding in a remote outpost on a distant moon. Syra knew what this meant. The noble might be connected to the attempt on her life. This wasn't a matter she could delegate. If she wanted answers and safety, she would have to investigate personally. But leaving the palace unnoticed would be tricky. Lieutenant Carter, Syra called, her voice calm but commanding. Daniel stepped into the room, his sharp eyes quickly scanning the surroundings. "Yes, Your Highness," he asked, standing at attention. "You're coming with me on a mission," she said simply, setting the letter on a nearby table. "This will be a covert operation. No guards, just us." Daniel raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. "Understood. When do we leave?" "Immediately." The two of them slipped out of the palace through a hidden passage known only to a select few. They boarded a small, unmarked vessel. Syra took the pilot's seat, her hand steady on the controls. Daniel sat beside her, his posture relaxed yet alert. As they soared into the stars, Syra couldn't help but glance at her companion. He didn't flinch under pressure, didn't panic when others might. She wondered what kind of life he'd led that had made him so resilient. "We'll be landing in hostile territory," Syra said after a long silence. "The noble we're after won't give up information willingly, if we're caught." "I'll make sure we're not," Daniel interrupted, his tone steady. Syra studied him for a moment, then nodded. She wasn't used to such bluntness, but she appreciated his confidence. When they finally reached the outpost, the once pristine Velthari architecture had fallen into ruin. Shadows crept along the walls, and the air was thick with tension. Syra stepped out, her senses on high alert. Daniel followed, his hand resting on his weapon. The hunt had begun, and Syra knew this mission would test more than just their combat skills. Trust would be key. Trust she was still learning to place in a soldier so different from everything she had known. The outpost was eerily quiet. Princess Syra's steps echoed softly against the worn stone floors. Once, this place had been a stronghold of her people's power. Now it felt abandoned, lifeless, except for the faint hum of energy shields and the occasional flicker of lights. Lieutenant Daniel Carter walked just behind her, his hand resting on the hilt of his plasma knife. His eyes scanned every shadow, every corner. Despite his relaxed posture, he was clearly ready for trouble. "Do you know what we're looking for?" Daniel asked, keeping his voice low. Syra glanced over her shoulder. "A traitor. Someone who knows more about the attempt on my life than they should." Daniel nodded but said nothing more. He had learned not to ask too many questions. The princess had her own reasons for this mission, and as much as he liked to challenge authority, now wasn't the time. They entered a long corridor lined with old Velthari carvings. The walls told stories of their empire's greatest victories, their most revered rulers. Zyra paused briefly in front of a depiction of her great-grandmother, a queen who had led a century-long campaign to unite their scattered colonies. The sight stirred something inside her, a reminder of the weight she carried, the legacy she was expected to uphold. Daniel noticed her hesitation. "History lesson?" he asked casually. "Something like that," Zyra replied. Her voice was steady, but Daniel could sense the underlying tension. Before he could say more, they heard a faint sound from up ahead, a whisper of movement. Both of them froze. Zyra raised a hand, and Daniel moved silently to her side, his knife now in his hand. They crept forward, the air growing heavier with each step. At the end of the corridor, a heavy metal door stood ajar. The dim light inside flickered, casting strange, shifting shadows on the walls. Zyra drew her ceremonial staff, its golden edges glinting faintly in the gloom. She pushed the door open wider, stepping inside. Her room was small, cluttered with data terminals and outdated equipment. In the center, slumped against a chair, was an elderly Velthari man. His eyes opened as they entered, dull and weary. He didn't look like much of a threat. Fragile, worn down by years. But Zyra knew better. "Princess Zyra," the man said, his voice rasping. "You've come to finish what others started." "I've come for answers," she replied coldly. "Who is behind the attacks?" The man chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "You think I'll just tell you?" Daniel stepped forward, his presence looming. "We can do this the easy way or the hard way." The old Velthari gave a long sigh. "So human," he murmured. "Always so direct." He turned his gaze back to Zyra. "But your people, we have secrets, child. Secrets you're not ready to hear." Zyra's grip on her staff tightened. She wasn't sure if it was anger or fear she felt. The man's words carried weight, an implication that there was far more to her world than she'd ever been told. "Try me," she said, her voice sharper than she intended. For a moment, the old man simply looked at her. Then he began to speak. Zyra kept her expression steady, her gaze locked on the old Velthari man as he spoke. The words were fragmented at first, half-truths mixed with riddles. But soon, the story began to take shape. "You think this is about one person," the old man said, his voice hoarse and slow. "A single traitor plotting in the shadows. But you're wrong, child. The rot goes deeper than you can imagine." Zyra's grip on her staff tightened. "What do you mean?" "It's not just about you, princess. It's about the throne, the traditions, the future of our kind. Some believe we have strayed too far from what we once were. They see your rule as a continuation of that decline." Daniel, standing a few steps behind her, leaned against the wall. His sharp gaze flicked between Zyra and the man. "Sounds like he's saying this is a coup." The old man smirked faintly. "You humans call it a coup. We call it preservation, rebirth." They see her as a symbol of weakness, a ruler willing to entertain outsiders, to bring in humans as protectors. Zyra's composure nearly cracked. "They attacked me because I seek peace. Because you threaten what they hold sacred," the man replied. "Our pride, our strength. To some, peace is surrender, and they won't allow it." For a moment, the room was silent except for the faint hum of the old equipment. Zyra turned away, her thoughts racing. She had always known there were factions within her court, groups that disagreed with her father's decisions, her policies, her choices, but she had underestimated how far they would go. "They've aligned themselves with outside forces," the man continued. "Not just other Velthari, but off-worlders, pirates, mercenaries, people who want to see our empire collapse, and all of it leads back to a name you know well." Zyra's breath caught. "Who?" The man's gaze sharpened. "Counselor Veros." Zyra's heart sank. Veros had been one of her father's most trusted advisors. He had sat by her side in council meetings, offering guidance, urging caution. He had always seemed loyal, even protective. The idea that he was behind this betrayal felt like a blow to her very foundation. Daniel stepped forward, his tone calm but firm. If that's true, we need proof. Something solid. Otherwise, this is just talk. The old man chuckled again, though it quickly turned into a weak cough. Proof? You think they leave trails so easily? If you want proof, you'll have to go deeper. But the deeper you go, the more dangerous it becomes. Can you handle that, princess? Zara straightened, her voice steady. I will do what I must. If Varos is a traitor, he will answer for his crimes. The old man leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes. Good luck, child. You'll need it. With that, Thyra turned and walked out of the room, Daniel following close behind. Her mind was set. The pieces were falling into place, and she knew what she had to do. The betrayal ran deep, but she would uncover it. She would confront it. And she would not fall. Zyra stood alone on the palace balcony, the cool evening air brushing against her face. Below her, the city lights shimmered like a sea of stars, but her thoughts were far from calm. The revelation about Counselor Varos haunted her. The man she had trusted, the man who had advised her family for years, was now at the center of a conspiracy against her. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to see Lieutenant Daniel Carter approaching. He stopped a respectful distance away, his expression unreadable. You're quiet, Daniel said after a moment. Not like you. Zara crossed her arms, her gaze drifting back to the city. I have a lot to think about. Daniel moved closer, leaning against the railing. Thinking won't help you win. Action will. Her eyes narrowed as she looked at him. I can't act without proof. If I accuse Varos without evidence, I'll lose what little trust the court still has in me. So find the evidence, Daniel said plainly. You're not the type to give up just because the odds aren't in your favor. Zyra sighed. She hated to admit it, but he was right. Retreating into doubt and uncertainty wouldn't solve anything. She needed a plan. The old man said the conspirators are working with outside forces, she said. If that's true, we might be able to intercept their communications. A traitor as experienced as Varos won't leave a direct trail, but his allies might. Daniel gave a small nod. Sounds like a lead. And where do we start? There's a communication relay on the outskirts of the capital. Zyra explained. If they've been transmitting anything off-world, we'll find traces there. Daniel straightened, his demeanor turning serious. When do we leave? Zyra looked at him, surprised by his unwavering readiness. You don't have to come, she said, though part of her already knew what his answer would be. Daniel shrugged. I go where I'm needed. And right now, you need someone watching your back. Zyra allowed herself a faint smile. For all his bluntness and defiance, Daniel had proven himself reliable. She turned back toward the palace. We leave at dawn, she said. Get some rest, Lieutenant. Tomorrow, we end this. As Daniel walked away, Thyra stayed on the balcony a little longer, letting the quiet night settle over her. She had always believed that strength came from control, from maintaining composure, from following the traditions and rules her ancestors had laid down. But now she realized that true strength came from making difficult choices, even when they risked everything. In the morning, she would face the truth head-on. She would confront the shadows that had crept into her court, into her life. And she would not back down. The relay station sat at the edge of the Velthari capital, a towering structure of polished metal and flickering lights. Princess Zyra and Lieutenant Daniel Carter approached in silence, their breaths forming small clouds in the cold air. The moonlight reflected off their weapons, and the distant hum of the city was barely audible over the wind. Zyra was focused, her golden staff in hand. The last few days had been a storm of revelations, but now, standing before the relay station, she felt a strange sense of clarity. If they could uncover the transmissions linked to Counselor Varos, they could finally expose the conspiracy and stop the faction plotting against her. Daniel stepped forward, his sharp gaze scanning the shadows. No signs of security. Either we're lucky, or they cleared out. Let's not assume we're lucky, Zaira said, motioning him to follow. Inside, the station was dimly lit, the air thick with the hum of machinery. Rows of terminals blinked steadily, and cables snaked across the floor like living things. Zaira led the way to the central console, her steps careful but determined. "Cover me," she instructed, kneeling in front of the console. Her fingers danced over the controls, navigating through layers of encrypted files. Daniel positioned himself near the entrance, his weapon drawn. He kept his eyes on the dark corridors beyond, his instincts on high alert. The silence of the station made his skin crawl. "Anything?" he asked after a moment. "Patience," Zaira replied. "These files are heavily encrypted." She frowned, focusing intently. Every second felt like an eternity as she sifted through fragmented data, trying to find something solid, an off-world transmission, a coded message, anything that would tie Veros to the conspirators. Suddenly, her screen flashed red. Unauthorized access detected. "They know we're here," Zaira muttered. As if on cue, a door on the far end of the room hissed open. Daniel turned, his weapon raised. From the shadows, figures emerged, Velthari soldiers in dark armor, their energy weapons glowing faintly. "Move," Daniel shouted, firing a warning shot that lit up the corridor. Zaira grabbed her staff and dove behind a console as energy bolts erupted around her. The quiet station transformed into a battlefield, sparks flying and alarms blaring. "We have to finish this," Zaira shouted over the noise. "I'll buy you time," Daniel called back, stepping into the open. He returned fire, his movements sharp and precise. Every shot he took forced their attackers into cover, giving Zaira the chance to keep working. Her heart raced as she returned to the console, fingers flying over the keys. Finally, she found it, a hidden transmission log showing encrypted messages sent to off-world mercenaries. The proof she needed. "Got it," she yelled, pulling the data onto a portable drive. Daniel took her cue, firing one last burst before retreating toward her. "Then let's get out of here." Together, they sprinted toward the exit, bolts of energy lighting up the corridor behind them. They didn't stop until they were back in their vessel, engines roaring to life. As they ascended into the starry sky, Zaira clutched the drive in her hand, determination burning in her eyes. The traitors had made their move. Now, it was her turn. The air in the throne room was thick with tension. Princess Zaira stood at the head of the grand chamber, her golden staff gleaming under the high lights. Before her, the counselors had gathered, their faces a mix of confusion, suspicion, and anger. At the center of it all stood Counselor Veros, his expression carefully blank. For years, he had been the most trusted advisor in the Velthari Empire. But now, Zaira knew the truth. She held the proof in her hand, the encrypted messages that connected Veros to the mercenaries and the traitorous faction. "This is a dangerous game you're playing, Princess," Veros said, his voice calm, yet laced with threat. "You have no idea what you're tampering with." Daniel Carter stood a step behind her, his stance relaxed but ready, his weapon holstered yet within reach. He said nothing, letting Zaira take the lead. "I know enough," Zaira replied. Her voice was steady, her posture firm. "I know you've been feeding our enemies information. I know you've been working to overthrow me." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the chamber. The counselors exchanged nervous glances. Zaira raised the data drive, her eyes fixed on Veros. "I have the transmissions," she continued. "Encrypted orders sent to mercenaries off-world. Records of meetings with known dissidents. Your network isn't as invisible as you thought." For a moment, Veros said nothing. Then, slowly, he smiled. It was a cold, calculating smile that sent a chill down Zaira's spine. "And what will you do, Your Highness?" he said. "Expose me to the court. Reveal my crimes and hope these fools rally behind you." Zyra's grip on her staff tightened. She had anticipated defiance, but Veros's calm arrogance unsettled her. He wasn't panicking. He was waiting, waiting for something. Daniel shifted slightly, his sharp eyes catching the movement. He spoke for the first time. He's stalling. In that instant, the doors of the throne room burst open. A squad of armed mercenaries flooded in, their weapons raised. Counselors scrambled back, some crying out in fear. Zyra spun, her staff glowing with energy. Daniel stepped in front of her, his pistol drawn. Veros chuckled, stepping to the side. "You're clever, princess, but you're too late. My forces are already here. The court is mine." Daniel didn't hesitate. He fired a warning shot, forcing the mercenaries to scatter. "Not if we have anything to say about it." The throne room erupted into chaos. Zyra struck with her staff, the golden light arcing through the air. Daniel moved like a shadow, each shot precise, each step calculated. The counselors watched in awe as the human and the princess fought side by side, holding their ground against overwhelming odds. Despite the chaos, Zyra felt a strange clarity. This was her fight, her moment. She wasn't just defending her throne. She was proving she was worthy of it. As the battle raged on, Zyra realized something else. For the first time, she wasn't fighting alone. The throne room was silent now, save for the soft hum of the palace's emergency lighting. Smoke hung in the air, and the scattered remains of energy weapons littered the floor. Princess Zyra stood at the center, her golden staff glowing faintly as she surveyed the scene. Around her, the Velthari counselors slowly emerged from behind their overturned chairs and barricades, their faces pale. Lieutenant Daniel Carter leaned against one of the marble pillars, his weapon holstered. His uniform was singed, and there was a thin cut along his cheek, but he looked more tired than wounded. He gave Zyra a small nod, as if to say, "It's over." Veros lay on the ground, his elegant robes torn, his arms bound behind him. He glared at Zyra, but said nothing. The once proud counselor was now silent, his plan shattered. Zyra stepped forward, her gaze fixed on him. "You will face trial," she said, her voice steady. "Your actions have endangered our empire, betrayed our people, and cost innocent lives. The court will decide your fate." Veros' lips curled into a bitter smile. "You think you've won," he said softly. "This is only the beginning. There are others who share my vision. You'll never keep the peace you dream of." Zyra stared at him for a long moment. Then, without another word, she turned away. She walked to Daniel, who stood waiting near the edge of the chamber. He straightened as she approached, his eyes sharp but calm. "You did well, Lieutenant," she said quietly. "Not bad for a human, right?" Daniel replied with a smirk. Zyra almost smiled but caught herself. This wasn't the time for levity, not yet. Still, she couldn't deny the truth. Without him, she might not have survived. His unshakable presence, his quick thinking, his unrelenting determination, they had been as much a part of her victory as her own training and leadership. "You've earned the respect of this court," she said. "And mine." Daniel nodded, his expression turning serious. "You fought hard, Princess, not just against Veros, against the whole system that told you to sit still and follow tradition. You prove you're more than that." Zyra looked at him, the weight of his words sinking in. He was right. This wasn't just a victory over one traitor. It was proof that she could stand against those who doubted her, who saw her as a figurehead rather than a true leader. As the court began to slowly gather, Zyra straightened her posture. She addressed the nobles, her voice strong. "Today, we faced betrayal and violence, but we prevailed because we stood together. From this moment on, the Velthari will not divide themselves by tradition or fear. We will move forward, united, with strength and resolve." The nobles bowed their heads, murmuring their agreement. Zyra stepped back, letting the court disperse. She turned to Daniel once more. "You'll stay here, won't you?" He shrugged, a faint grin on his face. "I'll stick around as long as you need me." For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Tyra allowed herself a real smile. Perhaps, just perhaps, she had found someone she could truly trust.